Welcome to the Best and the Worst, where I take a look at a retro gaming console and give you my picks for the top 5 best games and the worst 5 stinkers for the system, as well as an honorable mention that almost achieved greatness. For games in a series like Mario or Sonic, I limit the best and the worst to only one game per series per list, just to be fair. In this video, the Atari 7800 ProSystem. Originally slated for a release in 1984, the 7800 was delayed for a bit over 2 years due to problems with Atari paying the console developer, General Computer Corporation. Its capabilities were a serious step up over the competition back in '84, but by the time it was finally released, it was competing with the Nintendo Entertainment System and the Sega Master System, both of which had better graphics and far superior sound. The 7800 ended up taking third place among the third-generation gaming consoles, and was produced all the way until 1992. Anyway, let's check out the games. The 5th best Atari 7800 game, Scrapyard Dog. This is one of the few 7800 games with music, and also one of the few traditional platformers on the system. The game is notoriously difficult to play with the North American 7800 controllers, but with the PAL region gamepad, things are much better. You play as this guy with an enormous nose, trying to rescue his dog from a gangster for some reason, while navigating obstacles and throwing tin cans at his enemies. As a guy with an enormous big red nose myself, I can kinda sympathize. It's fun, even if it's not super addicting. The 4th best 7800 game, Desert Falcon. This is a very creative isometric shooter where you play as a Desert Falcon, taking out enemies, collecting gems, and using combinations of hieroglyphics as power-ups. This is a points game, and at the end of each stage, you fight a giant sphinx before collecting its treasure in a timed bonus round. Because that's what falcons do out in the desert, I guess. This is often considered to be a bit of a sleeper hit for the console, and honestly it's one of my personal favorites. And despite the difficulty curve, you can lose more than an hour with this one and not even notice the time. The 3rd best Atari 7800 game, Miss Pac-Man. Now, one of the things the Atari 7800 did right was to provide home console ports of Atari's more popular arcade hits that were a dramatic step up from the earlier 2600 console versions. Miss Pac-Man is a great example of that, and in my opinion, Miss Pac-Man is the best iteration of the basic Pac-Man game, and this is the best version of Miss Pac-Man. If somebody ever asked me what arcade games back in the early 80s were like, this is what I would show them. Truly a classic. The 2nd best game on the 7800, Ricky and Vicky. This one actually released only a couple of years ago, if you can believe it. It was an independent fan game, but it was released on physical cartridges, so I'm including it here. It includes a custom sound chip, which allowed much better audio than the 7800's built-in sound, which was held over from the 2600. And the game is best described as a bit of a puzzle platformer. The basic idea is to use movable blocks to collect all of the keys on each screen before proceeding down into some actual boss fights. The game is insanely fun, incredibly well put together, and I honestly believe that this would have been a serious console seller had it been a launch title for the 7800 back in the day. As a bonus, the developers released a PC version, and you can find this on Steam. And the best game on the 7800, Food Fight. This is a deceptively simple game. You just move from the right side of the screen to the left, trying to get the ice cream cone, picking up food, and throwing it at chefs along the way, for some reason. It's a points game, and you die if the chefs catch you, or if you fall into a hole, or if the ice cream cone melts, like if you just sit there doing nothing. Each screen is different, and really, this game is crazy addictive. It's not especially technically advanced, the graphics aren't anything special, and the sound is kinda goofy, but the gameplay is honestly amazing. and I challenge anyone to play this for a full 10 minutes, then put down the controller without wanting more. This is a must-have for the console. Well, now for the stinkers. The 5th worst 7800 game, Alien Brigade. This game is from a thankfully extinct genre of, scrolling, railed, first-person shooters, where you use the D-pad to control your point of aim and try to blast things that show up on the screen. You're trying to fight aliens that have taken over an army base, and some other soldiers that are helping the aliens for some reason, while avoiding civilians and POWs that pop up. The premise of the game is kinda lame, the presentation is awful, and the gameplay just sucks. Alien Brigade is terrible. On to the 4th worst stinker on the 7800, Double Dragon. Whoa, now I know what you're thinking. How could Double Dragon possibly be a bad game? Well, just look at it. This is an awful port of the arcade classic, with graphics far inferior to what the 7800 was capable of. The music just repeats the same intro ditty over and over, and the controls are awful, especially with the original 7800 controller. I used to be able to beat Double Dragon in the arcades with just a few quarters, and on the NES without getting a game over, but I couldn't even get past the first stage on this version. But I guess at least it's not the 2600 port. Now the 3rd worst game on the 7800, Fight Night. This is not Mike Tyson's Punch-Out, but is one of the worst boxing games I've ever seen. The characters are ridiculous, and the controls are just awful. Instead of spending your time with Fight Night trying to overcome opponents, land combinations, or score points, you're spending your time just trying to get some basic punches in and get the controls to work. This one sucks. The number 2 worst game on the 7800, Super Huey UHIX. Or it might be UH9, it's not clear. Just like every other attempt at a flight simulator on a 3rd generation console, Super Huey crashes hard. For once, the controls actually don't suck, but the game doesn't give you any indication of where you're going or what you're doing. In 15 minutes of flying around, I don't think I even saw an enemy once, and I ended up just wasting all my ammo attacking trees and bushes just in case they were a bad guy, because it's not easy to tell with the crappy graphics here. Hard pass on Super Huey. Which brings us to Karateka, the worst stinker on the console. Now, this game was released on a lot of platforms back in the 80s, and some were better than others. This is probably the worst, and it's basically unplayable. Even with the game manual, the controls simply don't work most of the time. It ends up being incredibly difficult to consistently throw attacks. The same button combo that results in a kick might do something entirely different a few seconds later, or nothing at all. This is by far the worst game on the console. Nothing but frustration, so send Karateka right to the Alamogordo landfill. And lastly, a special honorable mention, Dark Chambers. This is very similar to Gauntlet, and both were spin-offs of the same earlier title. The graphics are great for the 7800, the gameplay is good, and the controls work very well, and the game mechanics are solid. But the problem is the level design. You're trying to navigate a maze, but the mazes are just empty, and it brings the pace of the game way down. This one almost made the top 5, but the slow pace and empty levels just burn you out and make you bored with this game way faster than should happen with a dynamic title like this. Well, that about wraps it up for the best and the worst of the Atari 7800. I hope you enjoyed this look back at some retro classics, and as always, thanks for watching.